Hi, I'm Paige Henry, the owner of Regal Financial. We proudly support the YWCA Dayton's Voices Against Violence because we know the YW plays a pivotal role in our community. The session you're about to watch discusses the connection between homelessness and domestic violence, as well as some of the innovative solutions happening around the country. Domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness for women, and YWCA Dayton provides a comprehensive support through their permanent, supportive housing, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing programs. Please join me in making a gift to ensure this critical work continues. Please go to ywcadayton.org/donate.
So good afternoon. My name is Shalonda. I'm the landlord specialist here at the YWCA of Dayton, not as well known as our shelter services, our permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing programs. We are a housing first organization, believing that a critical piece to any woman being the driving force behind her own independence is a secure, stable housing. Through our own facilities and the many partner landlords we have throughout the community, we ensure that women who come through our doors find a place to call home. This afternoon, I have the privilege to introduce our speakers joining us to discuss the intersection of domestic violence and housing and homelessness. But before I do that, I want to thank our sponsors. First off, thank you to Regal Financial, our sponsor for this entire event, for returning as a presenting sponsor for this second year. Secondly, I want to thank this session sponsors, Greater Dayton Premier Management, for supporting our housing and homelessness sessions. We have Jennifer Heapy here to say a few words about their work. Jennifer.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you on behalf of myself, my Board of Commissioners, and the 7,000 families we serve in Montgomery County for allowing us to participate in this very important conversation, because housing and more importantly, stable housing really truly is the primary foundation for families. And also during this country's reckoning with social and racial inequity, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't emphasize something that we already intuitively know. And that's that housing instability and discrimination profoundly impacts Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And this is extremely important because a house is more than just a place to sleep. It can determine the jobs you can maintain, the schools your children attend, if your air is polluted, and the opportunities that you have or you don't have. And the reality is, in this country, families living just blocks apart can lead incredibly different lives. I believe this cuts to the core of who we are, not only as Americans, but as human beings. So GDPM joins the YWCA to resolve to fight harder than ever for those who lack stable housing and therefore the opportunities. And so thank you again for allowing us to participate in this extremely important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Heapy. And again, thank you, Regal Financial and GDPM. Now to introduce our speakers. We have Denise Contreras. She's the training coordinator for Ohio Domestic Violence Network, ODVN, the coalition of 75 domestic violence programs and agencies advocating for safety, well-being, and justice for all Ohioans in their relationships. Denise oversees ODVN's statewide training program and helps develop the continuing education curriculum for regional programs, training academies, and online learning academies. She provides support to staff trainees, allied professionals, domestic violence programs, and community groups. A member of the National Speakers Association, Denise has presented at state, regional, and national conferences on a variety of topics related to domestic violence. Denise is a registered advocate and a member of the State Review Committee for the Ohio Advocate Network. She serves on the Ohio Attorney General Elders Abuse Commission and other statewide committees for the Secretary of State's Safe at Home application program and the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. She's a funding member of a faith and domestic violence initiative to train Ohio's faith leaders in their communities in best practices for domestic violence survivors. Prior to joining ODVN, Denise served as a victim advocate for 15 years. She is a former newspaper reporter and graduate Phi Beta Kappa with a master's degree in journalism from The Ohio State University. Sharon McDonald is a senior fellow for families and children at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Before joining the Alliance in 2001, Sharon was the 1999-2000 National Association of Social Work Council on Social Work Education Congressional Fellow. She completed the fellowship in Senator Paul D. Walton's office, where she focused on welfare and housing issues. Sharon has supervisory and direct practice experience working the Living Room Program, a drop-in community service center that welcomed people experiencing homelessness and helped them access critical survival and supportive services. Sharon holds a MSW and PhD in social work and social policies from Virginia Commonwealth University and is a licensed clinical social worker. Now I'm going to hand it over to you, Denise. Why don't you go ahead and start?
Thank you so much, Shalonda, for that very warm welcome. I really appreciate being here today. It's a privilege for me. For the past several years, I have been able, through my role as training coordinator at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, to provide trainings and technical assistance to the staff at the YWCA in Dayton. From the executive director to the shelter manager to the advocates to the hotline responders, all the staff at the Y represent what is best about survivor advocacy. I have found them to be professional, very empathetic, knowledgeable, and they truly care about adult and children survivors of domestic violence. Today, you've learned about the intersection of domestic violence in so many aspects of a person's life. And I'd like you just to keep in mind I know you've heard a lot about survivors and batters, but it's important to understand the lived experience of the survivor, what this person has gone through when they come to shelter, and keep in mind that abuse, like all forms, domestic violence, like all forms of abuse, is really a power imbalance. It's one person wielding power and control over another. And the goal of the abuser or the perpetrator is to control their partner's thoughts, actions, and beliefs, so that eventually the victim or survivor may believe that escape is impossible. We know that batters control through many patterns of assaultive and coercive behaviors, but one of the most common ones is isolation. And batters are very skillful at getting survivors to sever ties with their family, with their friends, anyone who could possibly help them escape and provide a safe place to stay. That's why when survivors and their children leave in a moment of danger, there's often no friend to call or no family member to rely on. We know that the most prevalent form of power and control by abusers is economic coercion. Financial abuse occurs in 99% of all domestic violence cases. Typically, the batter controls the money supply. If there are assets such as a home or a car or property, the batter has all those in their name. Batters also control the bank accounts, the savings accounts, the charge cards. Sometimes they allow their partner to have a charge card or a debit card, but it's usually to monitor the partner's spending. There's also this myth that if a survivor has a good job or a successful career, they can leave the abuser at any time. Those survivors are under the same coercive rules. Often they have to turn over every paycheck and account for every dime that they spend. So it's understandable that when victims flee their homes in a moment of terror, they often come to the YWCA Dayton with nothing but the clothes on their back. When the survivors arrive, their needs are so great. They and their children, they need clothes, they need shoes, they need coats, prescription meds, diapers, basic essentials. We know that children in shelter need laptops and iPads to continue their education, and transportation as well. And I know that the YWCA Dayton provides these basic needs in addition to many other services such as safety planning, legal advocacy, counseling, childcare, and transitional housing. At the Ohio Domestic Violence, we do annual surveys, and we found in 2019 in Ohio, close to 9,000 survivors and about 4,000 children were sheltered at programs throughout the state, just like the YWCA in Dayton. But every day last year, over 260 victims were turned away because of lack of shelter space. That's why domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness. It's also the leading cause of homelessness among runaway youth ages 12 to 18. Evidence-based research shows us that if physical violence is present in the home, then children are 6 times more likely to be physically or sexually abused by the batterer. So if children are not safe in their own home, where are they going to go? To the streets. And who is there to greet them? The pimps, the drug dealers, and the traffickers. Sadly, we see that the tragedy of homelessness caused by domestic violence becomes an even greater social epidemic that's passed on to the next generation. Before COVID, we knew that there were already housing issues in Ohio, but now as the pandemic continues, the housing crisis threatens to reach a major tipping point. Programs like the YWCA in Dayton have had to reduce their bed capacities to account for this social distancing. We know that a massive 41% VOCA, Victims of Crime Act, federal funding cut threatens the functional capacity of many programs like the Y. And evictions have been halted by a federal moratorium, but it's only a temporary fix. Once those moratoriums are lifted, we know that evictions will likely spike. For domestic violence survivors, getting housing is often one of their biggest obstacles to successfully escaping their abuser. Survivors often have to make the very difficult choice to either be homeless, often with their children, or stay with the abuser because of lack of emergency shelter. We know that transitional supportive temporary housing is the best way to make sure these survivors have continued success. Both Shalonda and Jennifer alluded to that. We also work with survivors who are in active proximity to their abusers because we know this poses risks. And we try to help them get into a hotel or a transitional program that allows them the freedom to work with an advocate on their healing while they look for a place of permanent housing. No one is immune to these housing barriers. We do offer at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network and have worked with advocates like Shalonda, a rental assistance program. And that has helped everyone, including men, women, and children. But we need more affordable, low-income housing options for these survivors so that they can increase positive outcomes. In many cases, it usually takes 3 to 4 weeks for survivors to successfully find and enter housing or to get a spot in shelter. And the next speaker, my esteemed colleague, Dr. McDonald, will enlighten us about ways to increase the housing options and to increase safety for survivors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. And I really appreciate all of the previous speakers, and I want to particularly call out Jennifer's attention to the race inequity and how that permeates. It's something that we're paying a lot of attention to too. I'm delighted to be here today. As you heard from the introduction, my primary focus is, at the National Alliance to End Homelessness is on family homelessness. So that's the lens that I'm bringing to this conversation. And it's mostly around where I have value to add is around how a family homeless service systems and programs can be better supporting survivors and their families. I really also appreciate the attention to housing. I think a lot of folks talk very frequently about the intersection of homelessness and domestic violence without rooting it into the affordable housing crisis. Researchers tell us that there is, for very poor families, families under the poverty level, there's 35 units of housing and available and affordable for every 100 extremely poor families. There's 6.6 billion people living in poverty who are paying more than 50% of their income in rent, and 4.4 million people in poor households living in doubled up situations. So we have millions of people living in very precarious housing. And this was all before the economic devastation that has accompanied COVID-19. Despite the extent of the affordable housing crisis, only a fraction of these vulnerable families will ever enter shelter. Most hang on the best they can, and they suffer for it. They make difficult choices. We do know in the homeless services literature, looking at the data, who's coming in, that African-American families are vastly disproportionately represented. They make up about half of the people and families that enter shelter nationally. And researchers also tell us, just for context, that the younger the child, the greater the risk of entering homelessness. So infants are more likely to experience homelessness than almost any other age group. Infants are more likely to experience homelessness than toddlers. Toddlers more likely to experience homelessness than preschoolers. So it has a very disparate impact on very poor women, in families anyway, African-American single parents with very young children. So what does the affordable housing crisis mean for survivors? It means, I think, what Denise told us, that they are making very difficult choices. Should they flee an abusive relationship? Or should they stay? They may fear the lack of housing, the knowledge that they lack the financial resources to pay for housing on their own, and the fear that if they go into shelter, will they ever be able to get out? The lack of affordable housing can trap vulnerable survivors in abusive relationships because they fear that the alternative may just be worse for themselves or for their children. And we know that having access to affordable housing can solve interpersonal violence. Years ago, HUD did a study to examine what the outcomes were for families that received one of three interventions to exit homelessness: rapid rehousing, transitional housing, or permanent rent subsidies. They found that families that received a permanent rent subsidy, which is essentially a public policy promise that the recipient will pay no more than 30% of their income for rent in the private housing market while they have modest incomes. Families that received that housing subsidy were 1/3 less likely to experience interpersonal violence after being rehoused than families who received usual care in the homeless service system. This tells me that having safe alternative places to stay can help survivors stay safe. But this is not the world we live in. Housing subsidies are very, very scarce, and there are long waiting lists for them. Typically, for years, what we have had to offer families fleeing domestic violence and experiencing homelessness is simply a safe place to stay temporarily. And not always that. It is far too common, as Denise said, that survivors and their families seeking shelter are told that there's simply no space for them currently. Shelters are full. I've been working in homelessness for a lot of years, probably since I was 24, 25. Something that continues to astound me, despite my years doing this work, is that too often families are denied access to shelter. Having waiting lists for shelter just absolutely makes no sense. It's no longer an emergency crisis response if people can't get in when they're in an emergency crisis situation. So this is particularly problematic for survivors of domestic violence who need an immediate place to go when they're in danger. So they're in greater danger when they can't get in. So having systems that work is most acute, I think, for survivors and any other population experiencing homelessness. So now I'd like to just tell you about some of the innovations in the field that I think is very exciting and that YWCA Dayton is implementing, and I'm so thankful for it. We know that the affordable housing crisis strains domestic violence and family shelter programs alike. So some survivors and their families turn to DV shelters when they're fleeing domestic violence, not because they need the safety or the supports that those programs offer, but because they lack the financial resources to go anywhere else. It's their only option to stay safe. In addition, some survivors who do require the safety and the therapeutic supports that shelters or longer-term transitional housing programs can provide end up staying there longer because they lack the means to get back out and into housing. So what happens? Well, we already know shelters are oversubscribed. So if you have people moving in because of the lack of affordable housing after fleeing domestic violence, and people staying longer than they otherwise might because they can't afford to get out, you're going to have a fairly clogged homeless service system or domestic violence program. And then that worsens the need, the availability of shelter for those who urgently need it. And so that is where I think some of the innovations have happened nationally, and it's still really catching on, in all honesty. And I think that YWCA Dayton seems to be on the ahead of the curve, which is fantastic. DV Housing First was first piloted and studied in the Washington State by the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence with startup funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The focus was on how to provide the provision of mobile case management and flexible financial assistance and other supports help survivors who are at imminent risk of entering shelter find alternatives when safe alternatives can be found. For example, helping a family move to a more affordable unit, or to pay a couple of months of rent after the abusive partner has exited or been arrested or is no longer a threat, or to provide better security to a building. Can that lessen the demand for shelter? This is focused on helping survivors stay housed without requiring them to go into shelter first. So it makes it that much more appealing to a mother who doesn't want to enter shelter and subject her children to the move and the chaos of a different kind of environment. No matter how good a shelter is, it's still very traumatic for children and parents alike. DV Housing First is also focused on helping survivors move out of shelter faster, freeing up bed spaces and units for other families that are in need. This is accomplished with initiatives also like rapid rehousing, which is providing dedicated assistance to help families find housing in the community they can afford, help with financial assistance to pay rent until families are able to do so on their own, and follow-up case management support so that survivors are connected and supported through their transition until they achieve greater stability. So you're helping some families avoid shelter when it's safe to do so, and you're helping to minimize the time other families stay in shelter by helping them to reconnect to housing more rapidly. So what's the outcome of adding these two different tools into the toolkit? It means that scarce shelter resources are more likely to be available when families in urgent need require them. They're creating a more responsive, survivor-oriented system that is working toward getting families what they really want, housing where they can be safe. I want to thank the YWCA Dayton for having me, but most of all, I want to thank them for doing the innovative work to think strategically and to take chances by expanding housing tools and options for survivors. By doing this, they're creating a safer community for all. I also want to ask those who are listening to consider supporting the YWCA Dayton's effort, but also to challenge you to become advocates at the state and federal level. We need everyone's support to expand affordable housing, and I think the survivors you work with will depend on it and thrive with it. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Sharon and Denise. That was a wonderful presentation and super informative. Even being in this space and with these programs, I feel like you lent me some information that even I was unaware of. So thank you for that. We have plenty of attendees, and I recognize a few names that are in the housing space. So I'm hoping that some of them will put some questions forward that we can give to the two of you. I'm going to give all of our attendees here a minute to kind of put your questions together. Feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. And while you do that, I do just want to briefly mention that Voices Against Violence is historically the YW's second largest fundraiser of the year. As Denise mentioned, there have been, regardless of COVID, there have been major cuts to domestic violence and victim services organizations through VOCA, the Victims of Crime Act, anywhere from 35 to 45%, depending on the organization. And so your contributions today are critical to the services that we provide tomorrow. And so I'm going to share a screen quickly with all of you where you can go to make a donation right there at ywcadayton.org/VAV donate throughout the year. A similar link is available if you just take the VAV out and go to ywcadayton.org/donate. All of your contributions go a long way. Additionally, for those folks who may be local, you can make a donation through the Dayton Foundation. And if your company does a matching gift, feel free to connect with me, and we'd love to do whatever we need to do to make sure that we're optimizing your contribution. And then for those who may be on this call, perhaps you saw a session on housing and homelessness and thought, I need help in those areas. Please call our hotline at 222-SAFE. We have advocates ready to answer the phone and to connect you with resources here in the YW, or if we don't have something that'll work for you, we're connected to a number of community resources. So feel free to call that hotline. And then lastly, if you are here as a community member or a leader of an organization and your work can intersect with the YW and doesn't already, feel free to shoot us an email at info@ywcadayton.org, and we would love to connect what you're doing with what we're doing for maximum impact. So I have one question here, and again, to our attendees, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. This question kind of touches back on what we were talking about with some of the racial disparities facing housing. It says discrimination in housing, especially with rental properties, is a significant barrier for domestic violence survivors, particularly for Black women and those with children. Are there any remedies that work or any advocacy that is happening around that specifically?
I mean, I think it's a ever-present issue. Discriminating against people of color, people with families, people with young children is already illegal. And so there are also efforts you may be aware of around trying to make source of income discrimination illegal. So sometimes people with housing subsidies, if you're lucky to get one, landlords say, no, I don't want to accept housing choice vouchers, Section 8 vouchers. No, you can't come in. But it appears that landlords are able to get around that sometimes. They do other little tricks like, all right, we'll take we'll take a housing subsidy, but we're going to ask for double rent subsidy, double security deposit. So one thing that the homeless sector doesn't do, but some of our partners in the fair housing world does, is a lot of testing where they will where they will ask white applicants to apply for housing, black applicants to apply for housing, and report landlords when they're telling white applicants something different than when they're telling black applicants. When I worked in Richmond, the now Senator Tim Kaine brought a lawsuit using that model. I think so there's no easy answers. It's a constant effort, but I think sometimes maybe in the homelessness world and maybe in the landlord outreach world, we may be a little too passive we may be a little too trying a win-win relationship with the landlords and not necessarily say, hey, this isn't okay, and report it. I think part of creating inroads into the housing market when the housing market is so difficult, you need to generate goodwill. You need to figure out what's causing the landlords to hesitate, but that shouldn't be accommodating discriminatory behavior.
I think that's an excellent thought. Denise, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I agree with Sharon. I know at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, we often provide trainings, for example, for Ohio or statewide homeless coalitions, so that they can then go to the landlords and explain the situation, because domestic violence is very different. We know that survivors will present differently. Their obstacles and barriers are very different. So we found that education is often very helpful.
Excellent. Well, I have one more question for both of you, and something we've been trying to make sure we ask each of our sessions is, there may be people on the call who are new to this space or kind of tangentially connected to this space and want to do a little bit more learning themselves, a little bit more understanding of the systems that are broken and some of the systems that are being corrected, right? And so if kind of each of you could point to maybe one or two resources that you would suggest, books or videos or websites. Obviously, ODVN's website and NAEH's website would be great starting points, but outside of those, and then additionally, if the two of you have resource lists that you keep and would be comfortable sending those along, we'd love to share them with the attendees, but I'll let you each answer that question now.
I'll start. First of all, we're delighted to be partners with a group called the National Alliance for Safe Housing. We're some of the people who first did some innovative work in developing housing tools and thinking about housing responses and creating kind of a system or a housing response for every survivor. There are a lot of folks are clustered there, and it's possible to get training and webinars and all sorts of information. I think also there's they've also been partnering fairly actively with human trafficking organizations, which have a different constellation of needs, sometimes overlap, sometimes not, but very innovative work. I mean, I think this is, I think the kind of that housing first, rapid rehousing, flexible financial assistance, it may be old hat for folks here in Dayton, but it's pretty new in a lot of parts of the country. And so people can learn from you, and you might be able to learn from them, but there's lots of good folks there. And then of course I would have to plug our own site and homelessness.org. We have a very active advocacy campaign. We've been working to try and get $11.5 billion in emergency solution grant funding, ESG, in the Democrat stimulus bill that President keeps going back and forth with regarding whether he supports. We hope it's something the Speaker supports. And so one of our key priorities every year is getting as much money as we can in the homeless assistance account so we can have an emergency response for every family that needs it. So I would invite folks to join that, to learn more about our advocacy, because we have to go back to the mat all the time. And I think There is also opportunities around TANF. That's a key area for me, where I think there's some money that's set aside to be helping. There's money that states get each year to help low-income families with children that I think makes only a minimal contribution to preventing homelessness or to ending homelessness. And I think that there is a need for some state advocacy to pull down more of those resources. Ohio, which is you may be familiar with, has been doing a lot of work in that area. And I think there's perhaps great room for partnership between the domestic violence and homeless services community to get more state resources pulled down from what we would call mainstream players. The people who are charged with protecting families should do a better job of using their resources to protect families. That's what I have.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. I would like to add to that, if the advocates or viewers could go to the ODVN website, odvn.org, and click on relocation assistance. They can apply to be relocation assistance applicants. And ODVN has funding. It's generally between $1,200 and I believe $1,600 per survivor if they qualify. The application must be filled out by the domestic violence agency, but that is a great program that we offer in Ohio as well.
Great. Well, we did have one question come in, and it's a good one from our sponsor, Jennifer Heapy. She said, some cities across the nation have enacted nuisance laws, meaning that it's a violation of the tenant's lease to contact the police or have the police called on them a certain number of times. This is a very dangerous situation for individuals experiencing household violence who need to contact the police. Have you seen this in Ohio?
I have not seen that, but historically we know that in communities of color, survivors are very reluctant to call on the police. That is one thing that we know. Are you familiar with the nuisance law, Sharon?
I'm less familiar with that than I am with, there's a number of provisions in the Violence Against Women Act that are designed to prevent landlords from taking retaliatory actions against survivors of domestic violence. So, holding, and I'm not sure where, who gets covered and who's not. I'm not sure where that dividing line is. I would think NASH could help with you, the National Alliance for Safe Housing. But I do know that there are legal protections for survivors in housing that are not always implemented. And those are often not implemented because people aren't educated about them. So I do know that the District of Columbia has a group called DASH, the District Alliance for Safe Housing. And part of what they do is sort of education, tenant education, helping survivors who, before they fled domestic violence, just to understand what their rights are. And I think they've also done some landlord education. They've also had some success doing some landlord recruitment, also because they found people who own units, own buildings, may have had a survivor of domestic violence in their family. And so if you're searching for friends and allies, sometimes you can find them there. They're willing to take the chances. The other thing in the kind of using the homeless service sector lessons learned is that we found that what landlords are particularly concerned about is damage to their units. And not getting their rent paid or getting in trouble. And so often, sometimes what homeless providers do, and this is not specific to survivors, is create essentially accounts that landlords can pull down from, sort of a hold harmless fund, so that if there's damage to the unit or something happens or the person exits suddenly, they're able to pull down and remain whole. And it's largely been used, I think, with some folks who are chronically homeless, who, landlords like look at their rental history and they're like, no way. So it's like, well, what can we do to sweeten the pot? And people have found that they haven't necessarily pulled down the money. They didn't need to, but it's just how do we get over the hump of risk adverse landlords? But there are legal protections, I think, and I think that the domestic violence advocacy world is working towards expanding them. So if they're not covered now, nuisance laws, I think there would be a huge effort to expand it to include them.
Yeah. So Jennifer, to answer your question, it sounds like we have some work to do here in Ohio, and I know we have great partners in ODVN and the advocacy work happening there. So hopefully we'll see something come of that. Well, Sharon and Denise, again, thank you so much for joining us and offering not only your time, but your expertise. This has been a treat, and I've learned something, and I hope that our attendees have as well. I'm going to put up that link one more time. Again, if you're able to make a donation to support our work, it's critical and we appreciate it. And for those of you who have been with us all day, we've got one more session to go. So we hope you'll join us. For those of you who this is your first session, and I'm sure you enjoyed it as much as I did, please join us for the next one. We have our CEO here at the YW, Shannon Isom, speaking. And if you've never heard her speak, she's got some serious oratory skills. So I encourage you all to join us. That's at 5 o'clock. That's our happy hour session. So if you're home and off work by then and want to pour yourself a glass of wine or a glass of water, we encourage you to do that. And we will see you at 5. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.